I suppose the thing about layers is also key in terms of playing gamelan as well, because there was my first year in 1997. I could join in a concert within a couple of terms, because you do have those different layers of complexity within the ensemble. So you can teach someone to play a saran in a workshop, and they can, after an hour, they can play a lancharan. Great. So there's a situation where you can engage in it very soon, but you can keep going deeper and deeper into the music and learning more and more, and taking on greater challenges. That I think that's got to have something to do with why it's caught on in so many countries around the world, and why it's so appealing in educational institutions, and why it's so appealing as a musician, because you can be engaging and playing while you're learning. And certainly, having come back to York after a break of, 10 years or something, it's been really delightful to see how the ensemble as a whole has gone much deeper into the music. Certainly there's a much greater level of complexity now than there was when I was an undergraduate. And, terms being bandied around that weren't being used then, and it all contributes to the pleasure of playing. It's not just about listening to what else is going on around, it's about that kind of moment where it begins to click and you have an instinct for what's going to happen next, where you can sit down and play an unfamiliar piece and you don't need any notation. You can kind of guess what the next note's going to be, and you just have a sense of what's happening or where the passet's shifting. And
So to begin with, do you use the notes to learn the new piece here?
Do we?
Yeah.
Depends on the piece. Yeah. And that's true both of Karawitan and new pieces. So with new pieces, that's going to depend a lot on the composer, the way they want to approach it. Sometimes it might be just very bland, pragmatic reasons as well. So sometimes it could be that a composer is well aware that learning it by ear is nicer, but there's a concert coming up quite quickly, and so you have to compromise a little bit. Sometimes you have to make that judgment.
Have you ever thought gamelan? Have you ever thought gamelan? Teaching gamelan?
Yes. Well, that started, I suppose. I would suppose for both of us, really. When we were undergraduates, just playing a small amount ourselves. Some of the trips that we did with the gamelan involved workshops for school kids, for example. One of the workshops that I was involved with at that point, I think, was actually for a bunch of retired people as well. We did a workshop for University of the Third Age, I think. And so at that time it would have been Neil or one of the other senior members of the group leading it, but then there's room for lots of people to be involved, and that's the easiest way to teach workshops, is when you've got as many players as students in the room. Then you're all involved teaching a small part of it, and then subsequently I've gone on to lead some workshops. But I suppose often often there's a fairly blurred distinction anyway, just between being a member of the group and being one of the people that's teaching. You're going to help the people around you. If you've got a couple more years' experience than the person sat next to you, you're likely to find yourself doing a bit more explaining than otherwise.
How is it like teaching primary schools?
Primary schools.
You mentioned earlier.
Yes, I think there's not a really huge difference between teaching primary school students, university undergraduates, and retired people. There's not a huge difference. There are slightly different things that different age groups tend to find easy, perhaps. So, primary school students sometimes pick up things surprisingly quickly. I mean, if for someone who doesn't work with kids of that age much, then it can be surprising how fast they can pick up some things. Yeah. both musically, the phrases, but then also the motor control. All that can come very quickly. I suppose the most striking difference for me, though, because I think that a lot of adults can pick up things by ear quite quickly as well, even if they're not trained musicians, as long as they haven't already convinced themselves that they can't. And this is more of a problem with adults, because they tend to have convinced themselves they can't do more things. Children haven't had the chance to learn what they can't do so much. And so I think this is particularly noticeable. I don't know if it's particularly telling of a Western way of learning, perhaps, but I suppose occasionally, if an adult pupil is trying to, well, if you're trying to help an adult to learn a melody, for example, it can be a little frustrating if that person stops after every mistake to rationalise the mistake they just made. That's the biggest difference, perhaps, between teaching a kid and teaching particularly a British adult, perhaps. The British adult's very likely to use too much of their brain power trying to explain what just went wrong, rather than just relaxing and listening. Do it again.
Might also be a cultural thing. I mean, I was reading an article by someone who teaches, what's it, Filipino music possibly in Hawaii and the US in California, who was saying, you know, there's just a completely different way of rehearsing. The lot in Hawaii will just be a lot more content to keep going around till they've got it right, and a lot in the university in California want to stop and discuss every mistake that happens and allocate blame even and try and figure out what went wrong. So I wonder if that's as much about enculturation as age.
Yes, I suspect so. Certainly, it can be quite interesting. I found it interesting in Java if I saw someone that hadn't studied there before or was just generally less used to learning by ear, having a lesson with a Javanese teacher, that was often quite marked. It was definitely different watching a British person or another European new to Java learning with a Javanese teacher from watching a more experienced gamelan player or a Javanese student learning from a Javanese teacher. Which did seem to have something to do with, learning to learn by rationalising, learning to learn by talking about it, which has its advantages, I would say, but it's useful to learn to switch that off sometimes as well.
How does Gamelan affect your life?
It's hard to say. It's just, I don't know. I think if you play music from quite an early age, then you don't really. Well, for me personally, I don't think about myself as a musician. It's just playing music's just one of those things you do. You know,
Is it a difficult question to answer because gamelan's pretty much the whole of what you do at the moment? It's such a big part.
Even you start with Western music and then gamelan influence and
well, of course, getting to grips with gamelan music has had an effect on my overall breadth of understanding of how music works, perhaps. It's going to be a less narrow conception of how music works for me, perhaps. Though I suppose the reason that gamelan playing was appealing to me was that it fitted in with music making generally. So there isn't a clear distinction for me between music making in Gamelan and music making outside Gamelan for me. There's music making I enjoy and music making that I don't enjoy so much, and I tend to find that the ones where participation is the key and where oral transmission plays a reasonably major part tends to be enjoyable for me. Yeah, don't know if that's quite the answer to the question you asked.
How about you?
I suppose when you asked that question, the same happened when you were interviewing Neil. The title of this book by John Fahey popped into my head, How Bluegrass Music Destroyed My Life. I really don't think playing gamelan has destroyed my life at all. It's certainly what I'm mostly involved with as a musician right now. I suppose, well, in fact, when I came to York, I wasn't planning to do a gamelan-related PhD. I was supposed to be looking at a sound archive which mostly had Western classical music broadcasts off the radio in it, and writing something probably vaguely ethnomusicology based on that. And having failed to find my inspiration there, I looked at what I was doing as a musician, which was playing quite a bit of gamelan, and fitted my research into that. So at this point in my life, it's certainly the biggest thing that I'm involved in musically. And I suppose it would have been a big impact, but a very indirect one and a very hard one to define in terms of this completely different way of organising sound, of organising music, of arranging an ensemble for people to play music together. I don't know that came out in any particular creative way through compositions or interactions in bands I was playing with, but you know, it's there in the background as a musician. Yeah.